Hello and welcome to Sir's Baked Goods. Today we're going to be making rye bread. This is using sponge method, where we make a sponge the day before to develop that flavor and then mix everything together. This makes a beautiful product and is really useful. So let's get into it. This is the day before. I like to make sure that my starter waits a whole day to really develop that nice rye flavor. However, if you want to go quick and have the least amount of time while still getting some nice flavor, let it sit for at least 4 hours. So if you do this right in the morning when you wake up, you can leave it all day while you work, or you can come and do it at lunchtime and then make it for dinner. Whatever you prefer. However, you have to at least let it sit for a good while. If you just let it sit for an hour or so, you really should just make it the regular way where it's a straight dough, because you're not going to get that flavor that you really want. So to make your starter, put your rye flour. You can then mix your flour with your yeast, just a tiny bit. Remember, if your yeast is really old, you might have to double it, because the older it gets, the more yeast has died. Mine's pretty okay, so I shouldn't have to put any more than usual. And then finally, add your water. You're going to be putting everything in here tomorrow or in the next 4 hours, so use the bowl you're going to mix in. I'm going to be using the machine, so I'm using the machine bowl so I don't dirty a whole bunch of different bowls. So just mix it all up. It's going to look really dry right now, but as soon as you leave it for minimum 4 hours, like I said, you'll start to notice that it's getting a lot more wet and it's starting to bubble up, and the yeast is starting to eat and flavor your flour, making it amazing for your bread. Make sure you get all of this off. All of this will be great flavor in the end, so you don't want to lose any of it. Lastly, make sure you wrap this so nothing bad gets in there. This will also keep the moisture in and make sure that it doesn't dry out. If you just leave this on the counter, you might get some bugs in there, and it will become so dry that it won't be usable. It'll become like a rock. Just cover it. You can even cover it with a damp towel. That works just as fine, or just a regular towel. I use plastic wrap because it's easier. Make sure you leave this on the counter, not in the fridge. You need the warmth to get that yeast going. If it's too cold, it'll take forever. If you want to prep this way in advance, I suggest maybe putting it in your bowl 2 days or 3 days if you're going to put it in the fridge, because it's going to need that extra time, because when it's cold, the yeast will work a bit slower. However, I'm doing it tomorrow, so I'm just going to leave it on the counter and then clean things up. Now that we've waited a whole day to let that sponge develop, you'll start to notice it's a lot more wet and a lot more soft. That's exactly what you're looking for. We're going to add our 12 grain. After we're done adding in our 12 grain, we'll put in our bread flour. This is a mixture between regular wheat flour and rye bread, which is perfect for if you want to just get into making rye breads, because it's a nice stepping stone from regular wheat breads into a whole nother flour. What the rye does in this recipe gives it that nice rye flavor, that strong flavor. And what the wheat does is it gives it the strength as a normal wheat bread. Now make sure that when you're figuring out how much wheat and how much rye flour you want to be using for if you are trying to play around and make a new recipe, be careful that the rye doesn't have that much gluten and won't hold its shape as well. So if you go only rye, it's going to be a lot denser than if you have some wheat flour in there. So play around and figure out what you like best. The 12 grain is for texture. I like to have a little bit of crunchy bits inside. Tastes a lot better as well. It's really good that way. Once you have all your flour and dry ingredients in, make sure you put your instant yeast in. If you are using active dry or fresh yeast, make sure you put that yeast inside your sugar water, or in this case molasses water. You have to put some more yeast in because that sponge will have a lot of yeast developed and it will help rise your dough, but it's still not strong enough to rise the whole dough, and it would become very dense if you didn't put extra yeast in. Then finally, get your molasses and water together. Make sure you stir it up so that no molasses gets wasted. This is about half my water. I have the other half of my water with my salt. However, I want to feed this yeast and get this yeast alive and working hard before I put the salt in, because the salt will kill the yeast and could make my dough go flat. So once your yeast has had a bit of food and is starting to grow, then you can add in your salt. So I'm just going to mix this up now with my machine till it's just formed. Then I'll add in my salt. Start your dough on low. If you start it fast, all the flour is just going to go whoosh and dirty everywhere. So start slow. If you have a lot of flour and it's almost full to the brim, turn it off and on, off and on, off and on. What that will do is it will slowly mix it and make sure that it doesn't go woof. So let's start on low. Now that the dough is semi-formed, we can add in our salt water. This is just the remainder of the water, so half the water. Make sure you stir it up and get your salt dissolved so that it spreads out properly and doesn't just kill all the yeast in one spot. This doesn't matter so much with one dough, but when you're making 10, 20 doughs, all of a sudden putting in 100, 200 grams of salt in one area could kill that whole loaf. And if you think about it, if this amount of salt is in one area, this amount of dough could be ruined, which is 1 or 2 loaves that you could lose because of it. So let's mix it in. Now that it's mixed in and there's no more chance of all the flour coming out, you can now put it on medium speed and let it go until it bounces back at the touch. Depending on if you're doing this by hand or by machine, this is what your dough will look like. Bounces back at you. If you're doing this by the machine, it's going to take 6 to 10 minutes at medium speed. If you're doing this by hand, it could be 20 to 40 minutes, depending on how fast you can knead, how strong you are, is your technique good, things like that. Once you get to this stage, you need to let it proof. So you need to let it sit for about 30 minutes, depending on how hot your water is and how hot your environment is. Covering it with a damp towel works best, but all you really need to do is cover it. So if you only have saran wrap or paper towel, really anything, just make sure that you can cover it. But a damp cloth with warm water keeps it moist, keeps it warm, and keeps the liquid in, which is exactly what you need to do. So we're just gonna let this sit till it doubles in size. So whether it takes 20 minutes or 2 hours to double in size, when it doubles in size, that's when we know it's ready. Once it's doubled in size, you gotta punch it down, get all that air out. Make sure you do a good job here. Or what will happen is big air pockets will form inside your dough. There we are. And all you have to do is form it back into a dough. If it's sticking too much like this, obviously use some flour. Just be careful not to use too much flour, because the more flour you use, the denser it's going to get. This is going to be a free-form dough, so we're just going to put it on like this. So make sure that you get it into a loaf shape when you're kneading it, just like so, so that when you place it down, it's the right shape. If you just form it into a ball, it's not going to look good. Unless you want that design, I guess that's fine, but for this loaf, it's perfect to make it longer. Drag your dough on the bottom to make it tighter. And that will make sure that the top here is nice and strong, while the bottom is where your butt is. And there we are. Make sure to use parchment paper. You can reuse parchment paper if you're just using it for bread, which is what this parchment paper was used for. Everything will be killed off of it, so you don't need to worry about any bacteria or any health risks. Now the only thing left to do is let it proof again, but we need to cut it first. Get your nice sharp knife. Depending on what shape you go with, if you go with a circle, you can do a cross or just one across. But you can do this. I prefer 3 slashes. And don't hesitate. If you go, you're gonna drag your knife and not make a nice slice. Get a nice deep cut. Don't be worried about going too deep, because you have to let this proof again, and what will happen is, as this proofs, it's gonna proof upwards, and these cracks are gonna get big and look nice. So just how we let it proof last time, make sure you get your nice damp, warm cloth, cover your dough. This will make sure it doesn't stick and still be moist and warm. While this is proofing, we're gonna put this pan with some water in it in the oven and start preheating our oven. We need the oven to have some steam in it to form a nice crust before we finish baking the whole dough. This will make sure that it doesn't explode as much and doesn't have like little bits of dough coming out one side or the other. We'll come back when this is fully proofed, and I'll put this in the oven right away. It's now proofed to double its size. You can see now the cuts are nice and big and will puff up nicely. There's a few things you can do with the top if you want to differentiate yourself. You can just spray it with water, leave it as it is, put some 12 grain over top, put some flour over top, whatever you want to make your design perfect. It's all up to you. I normally spray it with water, however I still can't find my spray bottles, so I'll just be leaving it as is, putting it in the oven. This goes into the oven at 450 for 10 minutes, and then turn down the heat to 425 for the remainder of the bake. So let's get this in the oven and get baking. 10 minutes is up, so we're just gonna turn it down and finish the bake at 425. Here's the loaf, just nicely come out. flip your dough or your bread over, and it sounds like knocking on wood. That's how you know it's done. We're just gonna let this cool. I'll set it up to taste test and give you my feedback. I got that nice dark crust, which is exactly what I'm looking for. It's cooked all the way through, perfect. That dark flavor you get from the molasses, from the rye, and making a nice crust. The crust is definitely the best part of this one. The inside's nice and fluffy. You get that little bit of rye, which is perfect for most people because most people don't like too heavy of a rye flavor. This is a really good starter rye bread that gets you into rye breads. You should try this type of rye bread before you go into a full rye flour bread only. The 12 grain inside gives you some nice crunchy bits. Overall, an amazing bread. You should really try it out. If you really like rye bread, you're going to enjoy this one. If you've liked this video, please like and subscribe. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I even have my own website. Thank you, and have a nice day.